Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops, number 1 of Series 7. The question this evening is, does Charles Gray Shaw explain the ground and the goal of human life as presented in his book? So today I want to talk about a philosopher who is practically unheard of, Charles Gray Shaw. And I'm asking the question, does he live up to the title of his book, The Ground and Goal of Human Life? And to what extent does his view align with mine of value as a leading principle of life? I was attracted to Charles Shaw's book for several reasons. One, by his statement in an earlier work that is also my own concern, I quote, "Value as a principle of ethics has been overlooked by both ancient and modern philosophy." Two, by the audacious title of his main work, The Ground and Goal of Human Life. And three, that he was presenting a work as a philosophy of life that culminated in the idea of value. Though before continuing, we should say a few things about Shaw and his work. He was a professor of ethics at New York University who died the year I was born, 1949. He published his main work above in 1919, which places him in a particular historical setting. That is, he was writing before phenomenologists Edmund Husserl and Martin Heidegger, yet the ideas expressed in his work make him an existentialist before the word existed. And he drew on people like Nietzsche and Max Stirner. But his books are practically unread today. I'll explain why in due course. In his book, Shaw is presenting a philosophy of life that he describes as individualism. And this is an individualism that seeks eudaemonistic happiness, joy, and value, or worth of life, as he puts it. But this individualism is also antisocial, and he is deeply skeptical of orthodox morals, religion, academic philosophy, science, and society in general. And Shaw has no hesitation in describing his individualism as egoism, which he exhorts. Yet this egoism isn't the selfish to of Max Stirner or Ayn Rand that depreciates the value of other people. And Shaw goes to great lengths to define and contrast his egoism against other versions. Shaw's egoism was a matter of self-affirmation and self-assertion, and was not moral selfishness or hedonism. This is evident in his advocacy of sympathy, compunction, and compassion. But for Shaw, individualism and egoism go hand in hand with what he calls immoralism. Immoralism also describes his rejection of ethics in the form of religious injunctions or social conventions. Shaw calls utilitarianism's principle of the greatest happiness of the greatest number as a crass ideal. And he saw Kant as locking the moral will in a noumenal world like a prisoner in its own castle. And he went on to say that Kant regarded sympathy as something pathological. Shaw's antipathy to social and conventional ethics is clear, as well as his benevolence towards other people. But like later existentialism, he doesn't give us an ethics or specific moral guidance in how to treat others. Like virtue theory, he seems to suppose that good character will produce good action. This view seems to be supported by his belief in truth and an alignment with the world. Both of these beliefs are more contentious than Shaw seems to suppose. Another issue on which we could disagree with Shaw is in his conception of the will or volition. As in existentialism, Shaw compares the functions of the will with those of consciousness. But before comparing those functions, we need to consider Shaw's view of consciousness. That is, for Shaw, it isn't the primary definition of individual human existence as it is for some thinkers, including myself. He writes that he found it expedient to exchange self-consciousness for self-assertion because, quote, then the ego was a mere think. Now egoism is based upon a vigorous I will. He goes on to say that self-consciousness yields no more than the consciousness of the ego as that of one element among others. And such considerations lead Shaw to make the self the primary representative of human existence. Another comparison that we can make between consciousness, the self and the will is that they are all preconditions. That is, they are preconditions in a philosophy of life, not objectives in themselves. He writes, it is necessary to have something more than consciousness or self-consciousness. I agree that consciousness or its increase isn't a viable objective or solution in itself for the following reasons. One, it doesn't in itself specify or contain the particular properties that may provide resolution. Two, it incurs problems like anxiety, anomie, fragmentation, alienation, guilt, and awareness of finitude. And three, structures like temporality, divisibility, and graduation render consciousness intrinsically problematic. But for these reasons, I take consciousness as a more useful description of personal existence than the self. Yet as an exposition of individualism and egoism, Shaw gives us an extensive comparative account of the self. His account is historical, literary, and referential, moving through the Renaissance to modernism. He relates the concepts of the self to a great number of literary and other thinkers, but so much so, and often without argument, that they become tedious. Yet as indicated, Shaw's attitude to the will is pervasive in his thinking. That is, for Shaw, values are volitional and happiness and joy must be willed. He holds this view because as volitional creatures we must eschew the passivity of social thinking, and we must be true to our volitional natures in the expression of the will. However, I don't find this kind of justification of life imperatives adequate. Yet in line with the relation between will and consciousness, we are also exhorted to be conscious of happiness and joy. The underlying principle is, of course, that, quote, man must assert himself, man must will himself. But these injunctions are not only counterintuitive. In the cases of happiness and joy, they also face counter-argument. More than this, Shaw's view that worth, happiness and joy must be willed is challenged by experience. And it even seems to contradict his later view that these must be experienced with indifference. With respect to volition, Shaw never uses Nietzsche's term the will to power, but he implies a similar view. That is, his expressions of the will and strength, as well as denigrations of passivity and weakness. He also makes many approving references to the idea of a Superman. But this isn't the Nazi blonde beast, but Nietzsche's moral Superman. Yet Nietzsche's moral Superman and Teutonic will are also far from evading criticism. And we should note that Nietzsche's will to power is extreme and over-inclusive, extending to all biological life. Heidegger rejects Nietzsche's will to power as overbearing and interprets it as the will to will. Sartre reiterates and endorses the idea of the will to will in Being and Nothingness, and Shaw reintroduces this idea in saying that the will wills itself. But many thinkers believe that the will is still being applied excessively in such cases. For example, Hubert Dreyfus criticizes how some existentialists freely assign meaning to things without restraint. Dreyfus criticizes Kantian, Nietzschean and Sartrean autonomy that seeks to impose itself upon the world. He singles out the author David Foster Wallace as imposing meaning upon life in acts of will and control. Dreyfus regards this as ultimately an unlivable, indiscriminate and obtuse response to life. Yet consciousness, or the self, as Shaw prefers it, together with the will, are just the preconditions of his outcomes. He repeatedly states that the real foundations of the self are joy and worth and truth. I will discuss each of these three features in turn. Shaw criticizes the utilitarian maximization of happiness, but accepts happiness as a valuable human experience. Yet he extends the ideal of happiness with both eudaemonistic happiness and his own addition of joy. Aristotle's eudaemonism was a broader ideal than ordinary happiness in at least two ways. One, eudaimonia is better interpreted as flourishing or the good life. And two, it was also a kind of satisfaction that resulted from moral action. We will see how Shaw uses this idea of moral action as work shortly. Happiness is often thought to be of intrinsic value and thereby a prime principle of ethics. But one of my objections to taking happiness as an intrinsic value is that it need not always be a value. For example, I could regard happiness as encouraging weakness, as a misguided objective, or sinful, or whatever. My point is that if happiness need not always be a value, it couldn't have intrinsic value. Yet my main criticism is that happiness is blind and doesn't entail value. It doesn't answer the why or how of life. It is, of course, very nice to be happy, but a reflective character of human consciousness requires more. Human consciousness seeks understanding, purpose and value that happiness doesn't provide. And with respect to Shaw, even more refined states, even more refined value states like joy are subject to the same criticism. Yet joy can be criticized in another way by using Shaw's, my own, and a standard hierarchy of mental states. I previously advocated a typology of consciousness in the form of cognition, affect, will and value. Shaw similarly notes three functions of consciousness as feeling, thought and willing. These are emphasized respectively by Schleiermacher, Herbart and Schopenhauer. Shaw endorses these three functions as sense, will and intellect. Paradoxically, but further to Shaw's view of the neglect of value that I share, is that the idea of value has been omitted as a state in itself from the above states of feeling, thought and willing. Another idea that we share with others is a natural progression of affect states from pleasure and happiness to joy. And we could justify this progression by citing an increased value content in joy as in the above typology. Yet Shaw not only extends the range of positive states, but rightly instates joy as an essential ingredient of life. He writes, a complete life philosophy must not fail to include the joy of life, along with the conviction that life has worth and truth. In this way, he follows Nietzsche, who was called the dancing philosopher, due to his references to dancing in his books The Gay Science and Thus Spoke Zarathustra. But however necessary joy is in life, it isn't a higher goal of life. Shaw writes that, I quote, "The joy of life is thus the beginning, but not the end of a complete philosophy of life." And he writes that when the joy of life is properly related to the sense of worth and truth, the joy of life becomes a plausible ideal. So in Shaw's view, joy is secondary and must be related to worth and truth. We'll get to the idea of truth shortly. But we can first note that worth is a synonym of value that Shaw uses for a particular reason. That is, he describes his view as hypermonian immoralism, in that values are subjective and are created. In the post-existentialist and postmodern world, the idea that values are subjective and are created isn't a radical one. Yet the subjectivity of value explains his use of the synonym worth instead of value, which might be taken as objective. This subjectivity is explained in his repeated objective to get value out of the world, unquote. And this is done by putting the human will into the world. Yet having presented value as the goal of life, we must ask, what is the character of this value? Shaw asks, what shall man will? And adds that the will wills itself, and the will can affirm values. I myself proposed the principle of a will to will and a will to value leading to a sufficiency of value. But Shaw doesn't identify his value objectives as value states, like magnanimity or love, as I have done. For Shaw, value is invariably a quality of something, like of life, of truth, or of action. Yet he also says that life has a value of its own, and even that value is a criterion of truth. Or more telling, Shaw says that value can have both permanence and independence. And Shaw explains that this independence constitutes the intrinsic qualities and values of the inner life. I would like to compare this independence to my own notion of a sufficiency of value. Yet these two qualities of permanence and independence also remind me of Aristotle's description of eudaimonia. Aristotle's perfect good has both finality and self-sufficiency comparable to permanence and independence. The qualities of both finality and permanence reveal something about both Aristotle and Shaw. That is, neither finality or permanence can be easily attributed to values in the modern world. And my own sufficiency of value is qualified by an insufficiency of value. This ambiguity of sufficiency and insufficiency prompts yet another parallel with Shaw when he writes that value represents neither that which is eternally complete nor that which must remain forever incomplete. Yet without the esoteric language, this idea also reminds me of Sartre's view of value that I quote, "Value can simultaneously be and not be," or, in other words, value can both exist and not exist at the same time, expressing a fundamental ambiguity of value. So Shaw defines the kind of values that he presents as the goal of life as both permanent and independent. That is, they are subjective soul states, as he calls them, and their independence involves both freedom and self-possession. But in Shaw's account, they are qualities of or in something rather than states in themselves, and they are enacted in the world, enabling a valuational synthesis of disparate things. That is, Shaw is looking for a synthesis of society, aesthetics, humanity, happiness, joy, value, self, nature, and science. It might be worth noting that Takdir Ali-Shabana's 1960 work also called for a synthesis of values. That is, values as integrating forces in personality, society, and culture, unquote. In Shaw's case, he first presents a conflict between the individual self and society, religion, ethics, industry, and the world. But he then argues for a necessity of a synthesis between the enlightened self and the world, and then a dialectic. And even that art, ethics, and religion have been able to defend the claims of subjectivity. So this is part of the way that he is producing the synthesis. So Shaw presents worth or value as the goal of life, but certainly not as an isolated objective. He writes that a philosophy of life can be neither monistic, or egoistic, but must involve a synthesis of the exterior world of both things and persons as the place of enjoyment, of worth, and of truth. So Shaw posits truth as an essential concomitant to value, and as I have said, and I've said as much myself. That is, I previously outlined a similarity or a asymmetry and relation between value or morality and truth. That is, both value or morality and truth have inescapable claims of responsibility on our will. That is, we ignore these claims only at our peril of losing our self-respect and self-worth. And I side with Shaw over the possibility of choosing value over ethics. Shaw insists that mankind must have joy, worth, and truth, but that the deeper need of the soul is for truth. But he properly explains at great length many pitfalls and fallacies in a search for truth. For example, he tells us that knowledge can mean correspondence or coherence of thought with thought. and truth can take the form of classic, scholastic, rationalistic and scientific truth, as well as taking the forms of ancient and medieval truth. Yet these qualifications are for the purpose of preparing us for the truth of life, that is even more problematic. That is, what could the truth of the self, of selfhood, of the mind, or of the work possibly mean? We can understand what the truth of individualism, the Enlightenment, or scientism might mean. This is because these are theories that can be true or false entirely or in degree. But it can be strongly argued that some objects cannot be true or false. That is, descriptions of true or false aren't always applicable. For example, a chess move might be described as correct but not true. Yet Heidegger did speak of the truth of being, and Sartre spoke of the truth of being in itself. But this is no justification. Heidegger's truth of being has its origins in its investigations into Aristotle's metaphysics, and it has been well argued in philosophy that some things cannot be attributed with truth values. These include art, fashion and games, which aren't subject to judgments of true or false. Again, what could the truth of something like a table or existence consist of? We might have truths or facts about something, but not the truth of something, which lacks clear meaning. The truth of something is appealing to metaphor, folk philosophy, or attempted aggrandizement. If the truth of something means something, it should be explicable, but it can't be explained. More convincingly, claims of the truth of something, like Shaw's, attempt to attribute significance or importance. And even more problematically, there are difficulties inherent to the very concept of truth itself. That is, different theories of truth, like correspondence, coherence, pragmatic and redundancy, imply subjectivity. These differences indicate that truth isn't a presuppositional absolute, but a value-laden human artifact. That is, because choosing any one theory of truth requires an unsubstantiated intuitive judgment or appealing to some unnamed and unknown theory. Kant also defined truth as not a quantitative but a regulative concept that guides rather than determines. Karl Popper defined truth as a regulative idea, as it is unknowable yet offers criteria of falsehood. McDowell, Nagel and Williams also criticised the idea of an objectively true conception of the world. My conclusion is then that truth isn't a presuppositional absolute, it is a value-laden human artifact. There is no final theory of truth or a definitive conception of any truth. This is a difficulty for Shaw's truth of life related to the objective order, I quote, as an adjunct to value. There also seems to be a contradiction in Shaw's conception or conceptions of the truth. That is, between truths of life which have been created by humanity, unquote, and a conception of truth which can envisage the truth of existence and depends on that objective truth which is required to sustain the value of life. Shaw's objectivist conception of truth is evident when he says truth is not merely truth but worth also. The claim must be of intrinsic value, because to make a claim of attributed value is trivial. And he overstates the point by going on to say that by its very nature, truth is divine. Shaw's objectivist conception of truth is also strongly implied in his many references to the objective order. And this value objectivism contradicts, quote, the truths of life which have been created by humanity. So Shaw has a problem of objectivity, but not a problem of the indeterminability of truth, and he thereby doesn't need to resolve it with a will to truth as a will to the unknown truth. He can instead appeal to a hoped for truth of the world or whatever. To relate value and truth, I want to return to the idea of a similarity and symmetry between value or morality and truth. That is, they both not only have inescapable claims of responsibility on their will, but they are both indeterminable. To explain, one aspect of More's naturalistic fallacy was that the moral good cannot be adequately defined. That is, because it was an irreducible and shouldn't be confused with natural properties like pleasant. John McDowell had a similar view about the uncodifiability of action in Aristotle's virtue theory. I disagree with More that we can't define the character of moral good, which I do define in terms of value. But I agree that we cannot definitively define any particular moral good or the highest moral good. This is because they are always liable to reformulation and further discovery. This leads to a comparison of the lack of a final conception of truth and no final conception of the good. The indefinability of both truth and moral values binds them together in an interesting kind of relation. That is, the comparison of truth and morality leads them to evoking similar kinds of value. This is because the character of value is largely determined or expressed by its objects. Leaving out a discussion about intent, what we have here is a symmetry between the will to truth and the good will. But their objects are ultimately undefinable, and both claim ultimate obligations on the individual. But there is something even more significant here than this symmetry. It is the systematic incompleteness of both truth and the moral good. Like myself, Shaw is sceptical of using morality in this kind of relation. However, this scepticism draws the will to truth and the will to value even closer together. Yet although Shaw affirms the struggle for the truth of life, this doesn't become a will to truth. And for Shaw, truth qualifies value, but there isn't a distinct will to truth synthesized with will to value. For Shaw, the struggle for the truth of life takes place in the world of activity and work. Similarly, although he holds that the will can affirm values, he doesn't go on to the idea of a will to value. And neither does his question, what shall man will, with the already articulated will to will. He answers his question, what shall man will, with the activity in the world that he describes as work. I previously noted that Shaw presents a conflict between the self and the world, including our society, religion and industry. And he then argues for the necessity of a synthesis between the enlightened self and the world as a form of work. We should note that there is a history to the idea of a special work having a spiritual significance. For sure, this work creates value and synthesis as well as being worthwhile in itself. He spends a long time explaining the virtue and significance of this work. But I would like to question the significance of the synthesis that he is working for. That is, Shaw seeks a final synthesis of science, industry, society, humanity, and thought through the principle of value. But why is such a synthesis required beyond intellectual satisfaction? In particular, why is a synthesis between science and the philosophy of life required? Of course, we want to have compatibility and coherence of knowledge. And as Shaw himself argues, science itself doesn't have complete coherence. I myself would like to point to the disparate four forces of nature and also the a priori and a posteriori differences between mathematics and physics. So why can't differences of a philosophy of life, consciousness, value and science just be different magisteria? My answer is that a need for a further synthesis points to unresolved relations between these different activities. That is, as Shaw tells us, science becomes scientism in the imposition of its methods on human activity. But here it seems that we need just understanding and accommodation rather than synthesis. Yet Shaw's embracing conception of truth might not allow such accommodation. Yet we also need something else that Shaw also points to. That is, not only an independent understanding of human subjectivity, since afforded by phenomenology, but also an independence of a spirit to thrive in the world that I describe as a sufficiency of value. So I wonder about the necessity of the kind of complete synthesis that Shaw is advocating. Yet Shaw seems to anticipate this objection, as well as proposing a dialectic such as I have proposed. He writes that the enlightened individual outlines a still higher synthesis, and so on forever. That is, on value theory, sufficient value also relinquishes its previously needed cognitive support, and this can result in a greater level of sufficiency needing less support, and so on. And Shaw surprises us again when he writes that such a dialectic may be unnecessary when one is inwardly convinced that there is a living synthesis of these one-time opposites. Yet I have my suspicions about the viability of such idealistic claims. That is, despite Shaw's insistence on working out values in the world, and that his naturalism is opposed to supernatural, we may still suspect esoteric leanings due to his notion of truth and talk of such as the inner perfection of the soul. As well as his use of language, his religious language such as Satanism, soul states and cosmic knowledge. There are also other reasons to explain why Shaw has been neglected and left largely unread. Writing in the early 20th century, his anti-religious and anti-ethical views would not have been well received, and his eccentric views are matched by his eccentric style of writing. His style of writing might be compared to existentialist description, except for its lack of lucidity. And like a literary historical novel, it personifies philosophical positions that read like heroes and villains. This personification also socializes concepts with such words as sympathism and compassionism. And this isn't helped by using such words as introvertive, moralic and aesthetical. Neither is it helped by using untranslated passages in French, German and Latin. So in conclusion, does Charles Grey Shaw explain the ground and goal of human life? Well, he presents his philosophy of life as individualism and as an egoism, but not selfishness or hedonism. Yet it is deeply antisocial and critical of ethics, religion and all social institutions. This doesn't depreciate other people, but he doesn't explain moral relations with others. And this reflects the limitations of a later existentialism. But Shaw also fails to say anything about death or loss in this work. Shaw's ambition, however, was to explicate the goals of life as joy, worth and truth. Joy was a needed addition to the common objective of happiness, also added to by worth or value. And this is why Shaw is of interest to me. It is because Shaw presents the only philosophy of life that I know that culminates in value. In other works, both Shaw and myself bring attention to this unexpected neglect of value for various reasons. That is, in one sense, value might not be regarded as a viable concept or state that exists in itself. This is because value is a general or collective concept made up of disparate states, and these states seem so different that they might not all qualify as values. They can include love, hate, bias, self-esteem, moral will and truth values. Yet like other states, like consciousness or cognition, they are also general or collective concepts. Consciousness can include states like cognition, affect, will, value, self-consciousness and personal identity. Cognition can include states like knowledge, belief, memory, perception and intuition. My question is, why isn't the general concept of value similarly widely accepted as a collection of states? And such is the case in Shaw's philosophy, which doesn't adopt value as a viable objective in itself. He unfailingly presents value in terms of the value of something or the value in doing something. But value states do exist, like love, magnanimity and compassion. And these add up to not only a concept of value, but also a value objective. Yet this neglect of value, even in Shaw, as I see it, has at least two interesting consequences. One is the recognition of a vital relation between value and truth that Shaw doesn't seem to complete. Another is the not altogether undesirable outcome of expressing value in the world rather than a will to value. Yet the absence of the will to value also forfeits a principle of life, morals, meaning and purpose. So let me have your criticisms or comments on one of the websites like meetup.com, philosophy of value workshops.